Good morning, class. This is our lesson on Latinx Americans. A little note to make before: why am I calling this section Latinx Americans? Why not Latino Americans or Latin Americans? Um, I do this because, as you may or may not know, studying like foreign languages, many Romance languages such as Spanish, are gendered with regard to nouns. Anything that's considered masculine, any noun that's considered masculine gets an O at the end. Any noun considered feminine gets an A at the end, pretty much, for the most part. Um, However, this fails to take into consideration, like with regard to people and names and stuff like that, this fails to take into consideration people who do not identify themselves as male or female, people who are gender diverse, trans people, etc. So this is why it has become much more acceptable, much more, popular to describe Latinx Americans as Latinx Americans, to consider the diversity of gender, right, as not just this male female binary, right? So that's why that's that, in case you were wondering. So I want to, this is probably going to be a 2 video lecture because there's a lot of stuff in this chapter that I want to go over, but I'm going to just summarize it the best I can. So with regard to Latinx groups in the United States, the 2 largest are Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. And if you look at a map that's on Blackboard, after the Mexican-American War, there was a treaty between Mexico and the United States, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, wherein, if you look at the map, we got a considerable amount of land from Mexico, and that became part of the United States. So there were many Mexicans at that time that automatically became United States citizens. They were still treated inferior, but they were granted citizenship. Unfortunately, those in this group of Mexicans, Americans, often lost ownership of their lands because they couldn't prove title and stuff like that. So also, it's important to understand that Puerto Rico was also acquired after the Spanish-American War in 1898. It was considered a colony pretty much for all intents and purposes until 1948, then became a Commonwealth. And Puerto Ricans are United States citizens. However, their right to the franchise in national elections, they do not have that. They cannot vote in national elections if they live on the territory of Puerto Rico, if they live on the island. If they live on the mainland and establish residency there, they can vote in national elections. So some differences and things I wanted to discuss before that. So the beginning part of the book talks about some cultural differences. When we talk about Latinx Americans, we're talking about everywhere in the Western Hemisphere that pretty much has Spanish as its main language, official language. So we're talking about Central America, areas in the Caribbean, South America, Mexico. And so this is definitely not a monolithic group. Latinx Americans are like super diverse with regard to the ways in which Spanish is spoken, understood, different words that are borrowed from indigenous languages and perhaps African languages, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very super diverse from one country to the next, right? So it's very important to understand that there's considerable differences. The book does talk about some commonalities between some groups, and one is I want to explain the idea of machismo. Now, this is not to say that there's only misogyny and this sort of valuing of the masculine in other cultures. It's all extent and degree. Patriarchy is patriarchy wherever you find it. But something interesting with regard to machismo that we're starting to see actually protests in some countries with regard to the idea of femicide, and it's kind of tied to this, right? This devaluation of the feminine in many countries, particularly Mexico and other countries in Central America as well. So machismo, as the book explains, is a value orientation defining masculinity in terms of virility, what is considered manly, things such as honor, providing for the family. So masculine qualities that are considered masculine, such as bravery, strength, leadership, aggressive behavior, sexual prowess. These are all qualities that are uplifted and held as very valuable. Also, the idea that men need to protect women who are deemed weaker and inferior. They need to be protected. Now, you might ask yourself, and you would ask yourself this question very appropriately: how is that particular to Latinx culture? Well, it is and it isn't. It's not particular to just Latinx culture. It is. These are some masculine or patriarchal ideas that we find throughout the world, including in our country as well, to all extent and degree. But the book does talk a little bit about that, so I wanted to um, speak to that as well. It's not that we don't want to get the idea or the assumption that all Latinx men or masculine identifying Latinx people are like crazy patriarchal misogynist people. That's not true. It's not exclusive to the Latinx world. Patriarchal value systems are institutionalized all over the world, not just here in the Latinx world, but everywhere. And cultural norms regarding gender vary from place to place and from time to time. So it's important to understand that. But I did want to talk about that as well. So I want to talk about some of the cultural distribution throughout the United States with regard to Latinx populations. The Latinx American community is pretty much now the largest ethnic group in the United States, according to stats in the book, about 18% of the population. And this is steadily increasing due to things such as immigration, the younger age of the population, higher than average birth rates among many Latinx groups. In particular, in the south of our country, in the west of our country, in the states of California, Texas, and Florida, we have more than half of the Latinx population in the United States. More than three-quarters of the Latinx population lives in states. More than three-quarter live in states with a Latinx population exceeding 1 million, such as New Jersey. New Jersey, we have a large Latinx community in New Jersey, and also in major cities, particularly in Texas and California. So I want to move on to Mexican Americans as one of the largest Latinx groups in our country. So there's a large amount of cultural diversity within Mexican Americans, the community as well. So there's Mexican Americans, particularly the ones that became citizens in 1848. There's a group of them that are called Hispanos, that the book terms uses this term Hispanos, and these are people who are Mexican who can trace their ancestry directly to Spanish lineage, and have kind of passed into whiteness, right? Like without any problem, really. Now, there are other Mexican Americans who are more racially mixed. And then there's Mexican Americans who are more from indigenous groups, the Nahal people, etc. So there's a large amount of cultural and racial diversity within Mexican Americans, right? So in our country, as it relates to our country, in the later 19th century, many Mexican Americans, after we got all that land from Guadalupe Hidalgo, many Mexicans, were recruited and brought to the United States for industries such as farming and railroad building, particularly in the southwest of our country. And that is a trend that continued into the 20th century for agricultural business, right? So because of the close proximity to and sharing the border with Mexico, during times of restrictions on immigrations, we saw Mexicans arriving in the United States without proper documentation. One term that you may have heard before that is often referred to them are wetbacks. This is a derogatory term that was used to describe those, particularly because of part of the border between the United States and Mexico is divided by the Rio Grande River, which is pretty much the whole southwest portion of the border of Texas and Mexico, right? Um, that which is not the Gulf of Mexico. So some have crossed without documentation through the Rio Grande, then giving the term wetback. And it's a derogatory term, it's not a good term, so we don't use it. But oftentimes, Mexicans would be brought to the United States through the Bracero program, which is you would get a temporary visa to work on farms, and then you would return to Mexico after the harvest. And this is a short source of cheap labor without having to invest in the well-being of Mexicans who were coming here, such as with welfare goods, worker benefits. And this was something that helped to grow the U.S. economy throughout the decades, right? And if you think about it from sociological perspective, the instrumentalist perspective, the functionalist perspective, excuse me, how that really helped to function and helped to grow the United States economy, right? However, then you have periods of economic downturns, particularly in the 1930s during the Great Depression, and then later there was another recession in the 1950s. In the 1930s, the United States policy was to expel hundreds of thousands of Mexican nationals. And in this, because of the Great Depression, we talked about this story before, economic downturns usually leads to hostility towards immigration and ethnic others, right? So at this time, hundreds of thousands of Mexican nationals were rounded up and deported. In this, a large proportion of them were actually U.S. citizens of Mexican descent. About 2 million total were deported, and out of these, about 600,000 were U.S. citizens. We called it repatriation, but it was basically expulsion. Repatriation is a nice word for basically expulsion from the country. So this was a very violent process for many Mexican American families and those of Mexican descent in the United States. We had another program in a policy in the 1950s called Operation Wetback, which sought to expel all undocumented Mexican Americans from the United States during this time of recession. Not just the border states, but this also reached into some of the larger cities throughout the United States, particularly Chicago and some other cities in California, wherein about 3.8 million, according to the stats in the book, were deported, even though many of them had proper documentation and visa documentation, authorization to live and work in the United States. So kind of shades of today are back, we see this back into the 1930s and 1950s, right? So the book next talked about some violence against Mexican Americans, particularly in the 1940s. There were what were called the Zoot Suit riots. There's a link on Blackboard if you look in our content folder with regard to, let me look at the title of it, Zoot Suits, a fashion movement that sparked Mexican American resistance. It was partly a resistance movement as well as the men who dressed like this in zoot suits were targeted with lynchings, beatings, and other sorts of violence. And so this was pretty much concentrated in California, particularly Los Angeles. And it wasn't the only time Mexican Americans have experienced violence, particularly in the last several years. We've seen a dramatic increase in reported hate crimes and violence directed at those of Mexican descent in the United States, particularly in the one notable incident in the recent history was last year in El Paso, Texas, where a white supremacist opened fire at a Walmart and shot dozens, killed numerous Mexican Americans. And he had a white supremacist agenda, did not like immigration, etc. So I'm going to stop the video recording here, and I'm going to continue with the next video recording. So please move on to video number 2. Thanks.